All right, everyone, welcome. It's such a joy to have you here on this gorgeous day. We have hopefully a panel which will make it worth your while not to be outside at this for this next hour and 15 minutes. This is the University of Chicago Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression event on monkey trials and modern truths, revisiting the Scopes trial 100 years later. Of course, this is the 100th anniversary of the so-called monkey trial, and we just have a fantastic panel of thinkers to share with us the significance of the anniversary and what that trial meant at the time, and how it led in some sense to our modern, I think, set of culture wars that we still seem to be continuing to fight. The panelists, our host will be Peggy Mason, who's a professor in the Department of Neurobiology here at the University of Chicago. She has been on the faculty since 1992 and has taught many, many students, received many teaching awards, and we are very proud to have her on our Chicago Forum's Faculty Advisory Board. We have Will Schultz, who is a historian of American religions from the Divinity School, who focuses on the intersection of religion, politics, and capitalism. His upcoming book, Evangelical Capital, The Spiritual Economy of Colorado Springs, examines how evangelical Christianity and free market capitalism shaped that town into a hub of American conservatives. He's a graduate of UNC and Princeton and has had fellowships at Pennsylvania and Harvard before he joined our faculty. Michael Rossi, on the right, is a historian of medicine and science in the United States who works on how cultural and historical perceptions of the body have shaped ideas about beauty, truth, and reality. His first book explores the emergence of color science in the late 19th century and its relationship to broader debates about medical, scientific, and political authority. He's a graduate of Columbia and MIT and was a postdoctoral fellow in France before joining our faculty. And finally, we're very proud to have here Ed Larson, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and legal scholar holding the Hugh and Hazel Darling Chair in Law and a university professor of history at Pepperdine University. He has his PhD from Wisconsin-Madison, author of 14 books, including the Pulitzer Prize-winning Summer for the Gods, which we are going to hear a little bit about today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Peggy. Thank you all, and please join me in welcoming the panel.
Thank you all for coming out. We're going to open it up with just asking each of the panelists to tell us what they would like us to know. I don't want to ask them a question. I want them to tell us the most important thing that they have to convey to us, that they would like to talk about what they feel or what they think about when they think about the Scopes trial. We're going to start with our absolute expert, Ed Larson, who will give us remarks at the podium.
The now legendary 1925 Scopes trial did not begin with John Scopes defying the public will by teaching human evolution. He probably never taught the subject. The story also did not begin on May 7, 1925, when, with his consent, Dayton's city solicitors indicted Scopes for violating a new state statute making it a crime for any public school teacher to teach about human evolution. For all intents and purposes, the story began 4 years earlier when populist orator William Jennings Bryan, a self-proclaimed Christian fundamentalist, launched what he called his, quote, crusade against evolution. A charismatic fixture in American politics for nearly 3 decades, Bryan had burst on the national stage in Chicago in 1896 when he won the Democratic nomination for president by offering the cure-all solution of bimetallism for an ongoing economic recession. After narrowly losing that election, he became a public speaker by giving hundreds of paid lectures annually, peddling a shifting array of elixirs for whatever then ailed America or Americans. Anti-evolutionism represented his final nostrum for the nation's woes, and it chiefly appealed to evangelical Protestants. Bryan raised it in scores of addresses during the early 1920s, including one in Nashville, Tennessee on January 24, 1925, leading directly to the introduction and passage in March of the Tennessee anti-evolution law that spawned the Scopes trial. As a political populist and anti-evolution crusader, Bryan was a product of his times. Those times, the early 1920s, were deeply disorientating for many Americans. Whether true or not, many Americans perceived their country was becoming more secular during what would later be called the Roaring Twenties. Bryan thought so and said as much in his lectures and writings. Beyond repeating stories told to him by parents of their children's loss of faith, Bryan's evidence for the nation's loss of faith rested on primitive public opinion polls published in 1916, finding that half of the social and natural scientists responding expressed disbelief in a personal God, and that among college students surveyed, disbelief in immortality rose from 15% among first-year students to 30% among juniors. Now, Bryan claimed in his speeches that the poll found this figure rising to over 40% among graduates, but the actual survey showed it dropping to 24% among seniors and did not survey graduates. Whatever the actual facts, and Bryan typically crafted them or created them out of whole cloth in favor of his arguments. In the aftermath of World War I, the 20s were deeply unsettling to many. Far surpassing the violence of any prior war in modern times, between 15 and 25 million people died during that global conflict. Exaggerating even those numbers, as he was wont to do, Bryan placed the total at 30 million in a 1923 article. In speeches following the war, he condemned the role of scientists for developing the chemical weapons that made the war so deadly, and blamed the rise in social Darwinism for turning Christian Europe into, as he called it, a slaughterhouse. The war was followed by the Spanish flu, the deadliest pandemic in world history. It swept the globe in 1918, killing an estimated 50 million people, including over 750,000 Americans. The war also unleashed the largest refugee crisis in world history, with some 20 million people, mainly from Eastern Europe and the Middle East, driven from their homelands with the fall of multi-ethnic empires and their replacement with ethnic states. Many of those people headed to the United States, which responded in 1924 with the nation's first comprehensive statutory limitation on immigration. Bryan embraced these restrictions to protect native-born American workers. These political developments were all part of the nation's return to normalcy, which was the winning campaign slogan of Warren Harding and his Republican Party in 1920. Harding campaigned on a pledge to, and I quote, "put America first," which meant limiting immigration, raising tariffs, and imposing order by force. Further, the First World War brought Bolsheviks to power in Russia, leading to a Red Scare in America and fostering widespread labor unrest. Add to this the great migration of Black Americans from the South to the Midwest and California, one of the largest movements of people in American history, with about 6 million Blacks attracted to the promise of higher wages in non-agricultural jobs and fleeing the racial violence, lynching, and segregation laws of the Deep South. The migration impacted North and South, spawning the so-called Jazz Age in northern cities and disrupting Southern agriculture. Prohibition, new laws against drug use, and against interracial marriage came as countermeasures to enforce social norms. Restrictions on education, for your class, were a central part of the America First agenda. During the war years, states had passed laws to promote teaching patriotism, bar instruction in German and about communism, and mandate flag salutes and classroom prayers. Some of this had been done locally before, but with the rise of state compulsory education laws to assimilate immigrants, an increased number of states made it official policy. Education restrictions accelerated in the 1920s, with state laws requiring Bible reading, mandating the teaching of capitalism, and prohibiting teaching, and I'm quoting from one of them here, that ours is an inferior form of government. The anti-evolution crusade simply added a push for laws against teaching Darwinism. Historians have described populism as a movement offering simple solutions for real or perceived political, social, or economic problems. In the 1890s, bimetallism, which is the coinage of silver at 16-to-1 ratio with gold, as presenting a panacea for the Panic of 1893, the most serious economic recession in American history before the 1930s. Bryan wrote it to his first nomination for president. In the 1920s, out of office and relying on speaking as his main source of income, Bryan ratcheted up his populist attacks on science and the theory of evolution, which had long been but a bit player in his public addresses. A spellbinding orator, Bryan had already run through not just bimetallism, but also the direct election of senators, federal income tax, prohibition, women's suffrage, and Jim Crow laws as his cure-all solutions to social problems. As for his racial views, he opened his memoirs in 1923 by crediting his success, and I'm quoting here, to having been born a member of the greatest of all races, the Caucasian race. Beginning in 1921, Bryan turned against the teaching of evolution as his principal populist prescription for taming the Roaring Twenties. Since stepping down as Wilson's Secretary of State in 1915, Bryan had traveled the country delivering up to 250 public lectures a year from a few carefully honed set speeches. In a series of post-World War I addresses, beginning with the Bible and its enemies and rising through the menace of Darwinism, Bryan increasingly placed the blame for various social ills, from war and labor unrest to rising secularism and communism, on the teaching of the theory of evolution. Darwinism is the basis of the gigantic class struggle that is now shaking society through the world, Bryan declared in 1921. Why? Because the brute doctrine of survival of the fittest is transforming the industrial world into a slaughterhouse. He added in 1923, I venture to assert that the unproven hypothesis of evolution is the root cause of nearly all the dissension in the churches. A year later, giving a widely reported version of his It Is Written speech to a national convention of Seventh-day Adventists, Bryan finally rose to his ultimate conclusion, declaring all, that's his word, all the ills from which America suffers can be traced back to the teaching of evolution. It would be better to destroy every book ever written and save just the first 3 verses of Genesis. Well, so much for the Gospel of John. At least, he demanded, stop teaching Darwinism in tax-supported schools. This became Bryan's panacea, repeated in auditoriums, arenas, churches, and state houses across the land into the spring of 1925. The great commoner, as Bryan was known, only needed some state to accept and administer his prescription. Tennessee became that state in March. From there, Bryan's populism and the anti-evolution crusade led directly to the Scopes trial at Dayton. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michael.
Do I have to? Oh, this is good, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So what do I want people to know going into this about the Scopes trial? Well, first of all, I have to say that I probably have more questions than answers after having Professor Larson here, but I think the concise thing that I would want to say would be that I guess once you find out that the Scopes trial is not at all about science versus religion, then I feel like sort of all bets are off in some ways, or it's really game on. Insofar as, what we just heard is that the Scopes trial is there's notionally science and religion, but it's also a question of expertise versus individual judgment, or professional expertise versus sort of self-contained liberal sovereignty. It's a question about self-government versus sort of centralized government. It's a question of this is top of mind because I just finished writing a book about eugenics, and of course one has this question. One always, I think, rightly thinks like science good, eugenics bad. I think that's probably a good formulation for a way to live. But at the same time, one of Bryan's big objections to the teaching of evolution was that it led to eugenics, right? And so, and in this, he's not wrong. And then you see that some of, and again, in the science versus religion front, you see that many of the people that were most opposed to Bryan, many of the leading advocates of evolution of the time, people like Henry Fairfield Osborn of the American Museum of Natural History, were themselves deeply religious. And in fact, actually championed kind of weird ideas of evolution. So many of the proponents of evolution that were arguing against Brian were actually like we would think of as very not scientifically misinformed, but certainly like orthogonal to what we think of as scientific doctrine. So all that to say that in some ways the Scopes trial, I sort of imagine the Scopes trial as being like if you've ever tried to make a ball out of paper mache, you sort of have a balloon that you cover with paper mache, and then you pop the balloon. I feel like the Scopes trial is like the balloon inside, and there's all this other stuff that's sort of like assembled around it that remains. So that's what I would say about that.
Great. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. Yeah, it's a wonderful honor to be here and to be part of this discussion. As a historian of American religion, I'd like to mention two things about the Scopes trial, one of continuity and one of change. In terms of change, I see the Scopes trial as one of the very first steps in a decades-long mobilization of conservative Protestantism, which creates the Christian right we have at the present. It's not a direct line. There are lots of twists and turns along the way, but it's part of that mobilization. And it's interesting to make the comparison between those first decades of mobilization, when certainly the anti-evolution crusade was very intense. It had great champions like Brian, but a lot of the work was done by local politicians, local pastors, and efforts to make it into a sort of national political movement, as carried on by Brian, as carried on by religious leaders like William Bell Riley, were ultimately not terribly successful. By the 1970s and 1980s, you have a much more sophisticated infrastructure for mobilization. You have a lot of conservative Christian organizations which are able to carry on the battle on many different fronts, much more effectively than any of the organizations involved in the Scopes trial were able to do. And as part of this, they did not abandon the fight against evolution, but they did successfully incorporate it within a broader agenda. Rather than just banging one drum, they successfully made the campaign against the teaching of evolution part of a broader crusade against what they called secular humanism. So there's the story of change, the increasing sophistication. The story of continuity is the target of this activism, public education. You see it in the 1920s, you see it in the 1970s and 1980s, and you see it in conflicts in the present over the funneling of public money to religious charter schools, among other topics. So the people who led the fight against Scopes trial, not the fight against the Scopes trial, the fight against the teaching of evolution, they would see, they might not recognize the infrastructure of the movement, but they would recognize the significance of public education to what they were trying to do. So that's the continuity. So that would just be my kind of two takeaway points, things to remember going into this and maybe to remember when you take away from this conversation.
Thank you all. So these are some of the most fascinating themes, the strange bedfellows that were present in 1920s, particularly in 1925, so that, as Michael said, the evolutionists were also the eugenicists, and Brian, who was anti the teaching of evolution, but he was also anti the teaching of human evolution. It was okay for the little critters to evolve, but sort of okay, but sort of not. And that was, there seems to be something of a continuum between the creation story, the evolution of animals and then the evolution of humans. And there's the two extremes are highlighted, but there's that place in the middle. And I wonder if you could comment on how much room there was for that type of nuance on Brian's part, on Darrow's part.
You want to go first? I'll
Oh, sure. I guess I would just say, well, I would let people who are more knowledgeable, especially about Brian, speak about Brian. But certainly the scientific. I should say, in 1925, the scientific consensus about evolution was that it was a fact, but there was no good mechanism for it. And so people debated. People debated the origins or the location of human origins. They debated the mechanism of evolution. Again, the people that we think of as having as taking sort of hardcore scientific stance, would often champion a theory of evolution that had to do with something like a theory of élan vital, like a sort of like a spirit force that arises from within to channel evolution. So it was not at all clear, I should say, that there was like a sort of hard and fast, Darwinian stochastic evolution versus something spiritual. I mean, there's all sorts of organic fluidity between different theories of evolution, and again, which made many of them quite compatible with religion of all sorts.
Yeah. That would be definitely, I definitely agree with that. There were a lot of people, just as today, theistic evolutionists was still strong back then, even among scientists, and a lot of the scientists they brought to Dayton, that the defense brought, were theistic evolutionists. All the scientists they brought as experts were Christians, active Christians. That was strategic. And so there had the so-called neo-Darwinian synthesis, the synthesis of Mendelian genetics and selection theory had not gelled yet. It was just beginning in England with some of the work going on in England, at Haldane and others. But it hadn't gelled and it wasn't known in America. And what had changed by the 1950s, because the Scopes trial, Scopes lost. Evolution was banned. Other states adopted similar restrictions. Textbooks, therefore, to market, virtually every significant textbook in the United States dropped evolution altogether. It didn't reappear in the curriculum until the late 1950s when Sputnik came and the federal government decided it needed to step in and make better science education. And so they had money for new textbooks that instead of textbook writers, they were written by university professors, and evolution reappears in the BSCS curriculum. And that immediately triggers the lawsuits that lead to the fall of the anti-evolution statutes were still around, but then that immediately triggered every state that had an anti-evolution statute, then adopted a equal time statute where you had to teach both creation science and evolution science. The infrastructure was there, and they had another alternative. So, but on the other side, there was the same sort of mix. There was an institutional structure, of course. The Moody Bible Institute was the single biggest promoter of anti-evolutionism, and that had a powerful national reach. And the World Christian Fundamentals Association, based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Biola in California, were all major institutes that push it. You mentioned William Bell Riley. So, but they took a variety of different viewpoints, as you mentioned. Brian himself didn't believe in a 6-day creation. He said on the witness stand, he didn't care if the world was created in 600 million years, he said. He believed in the day-age theory, that each day of creation in the Genesis account symbolically meant an age of geological history, and therefore, of course, dinosaurs and other animals were around before that. And his focus was solely that he thought the Bible was very specific about Adam and Eve, leading to Darrow's famous question on the witness stand, well, then where'd Cain get his wife? Which Brian said, I'll leave the skeptics to look for, or the agnostics to look for. But Brian had in science, you had a lot of theistic evolutionists, as you still have today. Francis Collins is a theistic evolutionist. And on the other side, you had the very few young earth creationists, maybe a few in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but mostly believing in a long earth history and drawing the line, as you point out, on humans, that humans are directly created in the image of God, and that was what Brian was willing to battle for.
Yeah, so building on what Professor Larson said, even within the fairly conservative Protestant community, you've got a wide variety of understandings of evolution, even though they do draw the line at certain points. And so it's interesting to look at something like the Fundamentals, which is this multi-volume declaration of conservative Protestant ideals published in the 1910s, which if you're ever looking for, if you're ever having trouble going to sleep, you could just try picking up any volume and reading through it, and that will put you off pretty quickly. So the interesting thing with the Fundamentals is that they relatively avoid the question of evolution and Darwinism precisely because there is some degree of diversity there. And yet, the Fundamentals also make very clear what they perceive as at stake beyond even the teaching of evolution. For them, the key idea is biblical authority. That anything which would seem to call into question the basic idea of biblical authority had to be pushed aside as quickly as possible. And so if one were to be open to some varieties of evolution, you had to find a way to make that thoroughly compatible with fairly common sense, as they would have understood it, readings of the Bible. So you have this sort of interesting tension. There's a good bit of diversity, but there's also in things like the Fundamentals an attempt to make clear, all right, here's where we stand. We can't go any further than this. You can, talk about, little creatures evolving, but biblical authority has to remain unchallenged. That is the most significant thing.
Do you want to ask?
Actually, can I ask a question of my panelists? Because this is something I've wondered. So, following on those lines, I was wondering.
Michael.
So, following on those lines, I was wondering if the fundamental divides were sectarian or regional. Because I'm thinking about someone like I think James McCosh at Princeton, right? Is my understanding he's the first person to introduce the teaching of evolution into sort of a college curriculum. But he was religious enough that, and he was he sort of taught a generation of biologists and scientists. But he was so religious that his students called him like Christocentric, and yet he's also willing to teach evolution. And so I wondered if this line is being drawn by region, right, or if it's being drawn through sect, or how can we understand that? I guess is something I was wrestling with as you were both speaking.
You go first?
Sure. I mean, anything that I could say about the regional difference, I would just be cribbing on what I remember from reading Summer for the Gods. So I will let Professor Larson speak more authoritatively on that question. But the sectarian divide was very significant. Baptists and Presbyterians in particular played a major role in pushing back against the teaching of evolution. And then beyond those specific sectarian divides, though, you also have this very self-consciously non-denominational fundamentalist movement who are actively trying to erase sectarian boundaries because they see it as an obstacle to Protestant unity, an obstacle to the goal of Christianizing the United States. And so for some of them, anti-evolution, again, for someone like William Bell Riley, anti-evolution is the way to transcend those denominational divides. And his efforts are only partly successful, but that is one of the dynamics at work.
William Bell Riley, just picking up on what you're saying, for those you know, William Bell Riley was a minister in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and he founded the World's Christian Fundamentals Association. The term fundamentalist was only coined in 1918. It didn't exist before. So before that, when you talk about the fundamentals of faith, it was borrowed from that. And people had lists of the fundamentals of the conservatives. Conservative evangelicals had their own lists. And there have been people who've collected all these lists, and they ran anywhere from like 12 points to 5 points. The virgin birth was always one of them. Other ones sort of varied. And what they said about the Genesis differed. They sometimes were in and sometimes they weren't. So that's right. That's be an area of disagreement. But the virgin birth and miracles and a few things like that. The bodily resurrection of Christ, that would be one of them. But William Bell Riley tried to reach out. I think he was Baptist, but he tried to reach out and create an interdenominational organization because he thought the National Council of Churches was a bunch of modernists who'd gone crazy, influenced by German higher criticism. And so he tried to create a parallel organization. And what he tried to do, based in Minneapolis, and he used the word, and notice how ambitious he was. It wasn't the America, but it was the world's fundamentalist Christian association. He had international goals and sent out international missionaries. Those have been revealed. Those have been realized today. There are evangelical ministries all over Africa and South America and wherever. And so, but he tried to cross denominational lines. And so the denominations split. And anti-evolution was one of the best efforts. What they were really fighting was German higher criticism. But anti-evolutionism was a simple one. And it started out, when they were doing it, it was before Bryan, before the idea of laws for schools, before they had the brilliant idea, as you guys pointed out, that schools are a great place to draw in a broad thing. They were fought within the churches over what was preached in the pulpit about Genesis. And so you have early creation evolution battles or anti-evolution battles fought way back to the 1880s, but they all involved seminaries or pulpits. Who was preaching? Woodrow Wilson's father was caught up in one of those. They tried to reach across and they tried to pull out the conservative individual churches among Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists. I agree, those were Presbyterian, Baptist, and secondarily Methodist. So it was cross-denominational. Now you did have some fundamentalist, quasi-proto-fundamentalist, smaller denominations like the Church of Christ that existed. You also had the Foursquare Gospel movement. You had McPherson out there in California. You had the beginning of the charismatic movement, and they picked up on a lot of that. As for regional, on one hand, it seemed to resonate better in the South, which was still living in the lost cause of the Confederacy, and they were in living memories of the Civil War. And these were all white churches, and they had this sense that the North was against them. But the basis of all the groups were in the North. They were Chicago. There was Los Angeles. It was New York with what's his name in that not the Riverside, but the other one. And then you had Tory in Boston. You had T.T. Shields in Toronto. You had Seattle. So the basis of a lot of this was in the North, but they did have their most success in the South. And they pulled off more churches off the Presbyterians and the Methodists and even the Episcopalians to some extent and the Presbyterians in the South. And you see it today in the Southern Presbyterian Church, I guess it's called PCA now, versus PCUSA, because that divide, and the PCA is still highly creationist.
So we are going to open it up, but I'm going to take moderators' privilege and ask one final question. And we're going to stay in history because I think the questions will probably bring us into the present. So one of the things that's really surprising, because my knowledge of the Scopes trial before this was pretty superficial, was how there was a group who met in a I don't know, drugstore to arrange for Scopes to be the defendant, for the Hicks brothers to be the prosecutors, for this one to be the defense, for this guy to arrest him. So it was a one-shop deal. What's in it? Why did they do that? Well, they did it because the ACLU advertised that they wanted somebody to test this law. And so arguably Dayton's motivation was nothing lofty, except they wanted publicity for Dayton. They thought lots of people would come to Dayton. It would be an economic boon. Meanwhile, the ACLU's motivation is mostly about academic freedom. You should teach what you want in the schools. Darrow gets involved. He's a virulent atheist, and ACLU is irritated as hell because now this is about God instead of academic freedom. And the local prosecutor was a man who had been dismissed from from the University of Tennessee.
He was a character.
He was a character, and basically he wanted his job back. So there's so many motivations here, and yet what comes out of that historically is so much less rich than what went into it. And I would just love to hear your comments on that.
Beautiful introduction, yeah. It was. There was mixed motives all the way around, and that has led to the reason why it was so good for myth making. And both sides drew their myths. People lost sight of what actually happened in the Scopes trial, and we live in the myth or the folklore of it. And there's a secular folklore captured in Inherit the Wind, where it says right in the closing, right in the statements, Tom Scopes, after he's convicted, turns to Darrow in the movie or in the play and asks, "Did I win or did I lose?" And Spencer Tracy or Frederick or Paul Mooney in the play would said, "Well, you won. You smashed a bad law. You made it a joke." But that's not how the evangelicals viewed it. They viewed it as a smashing victory. Scopes had been convicted. They still celebrate the Scopes trial as the time they won. And Brian became a martyr to the cause when he happened to die a week later. Hundreds of thousands of people poured out to watch his body being carried in a special train for a state funeral in Washington, D.C. His body was carried to the grave. Every pallbearer was a U.S. senator. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery. He was a national hero, and state after state and community after community followed the lead of Tennessee and barred the teaching of evolution. And if you ever doubt that myth, go down to Dayton, Tennessee, any July, and you can watch their play about the Scopes trial. I'll be there this year for the 100th. And Brian wins. And Darrow at the end sort of looks at him and says, "You were right all along." It's a different myth. And that's the way evangelicals, they view it as a foundational myth. They like the Scopes trial.
I would just add that, it's a sort of capstone irony, right? That in this, if you could view the Scopes trial as, a competition between sort of like monocausal, simple answers to complicated questions, versus, trying to embrace the complexity of something like evolution. Actually, both sides came away with a pretty monocausal, simple view of what happened, just diametrically opposed. And I do think that, we can maybe get into this with the Q&A, but I do think that interpretation or misinterpretation has sort of informed both the way that we think about Scopes in relation to things like anti-vaccine movements and climate change denialism, things like this. I guess I'll just spoiler alert, I don't actually think that there's that much of a line between Scopes and anti-vaxxing and climate change denial, but that sort of reduction tends to make it, the reduction of the legend of the Scopes myth makes that seem very apparent, whereas I think it obscures our sort of richer understanding.
Yeah. Professor Larson, I heard you mention earlier in the conversation the idea of culture wars and how that's kind of a silly notion, which, did I?
I don't remember that. But.
Okay. Well, if I imagined it, then I will still use it as a jumping off point. You have this concept of the culture wars, which the Scopes trial helps contribute to.
Yeah.
The idea that there's this irreconcilable clash between science and religion. And while I don't want to dismiss those conflicts out of hand, I think it really, when we overlook the complexity of the factors that go into it, as Professor Mason talked about, and make it just the clash between these two irreconcilable forces, you lose a lot. And one of the things you lose is the role of experts on both sides of this debate, of ministers and academics who are, in their different ways, trying to mobilize people. So this is not just a question of the experts on one side and the people on the other. You've got conflicting classes of experts, both trying to play to a mass audience, to judges, to voters. And you see that dynamic down to the present. I know we said we didn't want to get into the present too quickly, but simplistic reading of the Scopes trial, it's just a culture war story. Again, cultural conflicts are real, but any idea that the American people are or always have been divided into kind of two camps is not good history. It's not good political science. It's just, period, not good. You need attention to the complexity of it, the people that went into it.
Sorry, I am going to turn it over. One last thing. I cannot help but think about the 1927 Buck versus Bell, which, as some of you may know, is when Holmes uttered his famous judgment that three generations of imbeciles is enough in supporting sterilization of somebody who was allegedly, in the words of that day, an imbecile who was in fact not. There's a great book out called Three Generations, No Imbeciles.
Right.
But in that trial, again, it was a group of people that populated the prosecution and the defense. There was cahoots.
Yeah, and both sides really supported eugenics. Eugenics was never an issue at the trial. It was never mentioned once at the trial. It just wasn't an issue. And Brian's wife was on the chief eugenics committee, chief women's eugenics committee, and Brian and his wife were very close. So Brian wasn't opposed to eugenics. I mean, it wasn't an issue at the trial. Because, if there was anybody who was anti-eugenics in the group, it was Clarence Darrow.
Yeah.
His experts were all pro-eugenics. So what do you got?
Some of the most prominent ones, David Starr Jordan, for example. Yeah.
Chicago produced Charles Davenport, the most important eugenicist in the history of America, was a professor here.
Great. So we're going to open up for questions. Are there questions? We have a couple of microphones. Yeah. Great.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. This was a really great talk. My question was sort of building on the earlier question about sectarian differences. What was the role of the Scopes trial and the debate on evolution on non-Protestant Christian groups, like Latter-day Saints or Roman Catholics? It seems like those groups had very contentious relationships with a lot of mainstream Protestant Christianity. So what role did the Scopes trial play for them? And what role, if any, did the Scopes trial play in the division between mainline Protestants and evangelicals? Thank you.
Interesting. I mean, that's a very good question. The mainline tended to support. Remember, the ACLU had been founded by Quakers, it was a religious organization. It was founded by Quakers during the World War I to defend pacifists and conscientious objectors. And it still had strong religious overtones, but they tended to be sort of Quaker and sort of modernist. And so the modernist, Calvin Coolidge was a classic modernist, very conservative, but a classic modernist, very religious. He was the president then. He took advantage of the trial. He was attacking Bryan. He was attacking the fundamentalists. Hoover was a very prominent Republican leader. Again, he was a Quaker, prominently religious. You got Nicholson. You have a whole variety of mainline Protestants who were backing the ACLU and the defense of Scopes. As for other religion, and where the charismatics tended to lean toward Bryan, they were just forming. The evangelicals leaned toward Bryan. You look toward other religions, the Catholics, Bryan tried very hard to recruit both Catholics and Jewish people to his side. Louis Untermeyer was then head of, I think, the American Jewish Committee, and he got his support. He tried to get Bora, the Catholic senator from Montana, to come down with him. So he tried to get some support. There were the Knights of Columbus, which was a Catholic organization, did back Bryan. The Klan backed Bryan, and Klan was very powerful at that time, huge in the 50s, in the 20s. But the Catholic Church as a whole had before sort of reached an accommodation that is way back in the 1890s, that as long as God endowed a soul into an evolved ape, that was fine. You could believe that and it'd be okay. They didn't mandate it, and they pictured the Sistine Chapel of God reaching down with his finger, and here was Adam receiving the soul. And what made humans different was the soul. And that accorded with the theistic evolution. And so Catholics split somewhere, and Bryan tried to recruit them, but overall they were on the other side. As for the African Americans, Du Bois was a big supporter of the ACLU and he spoke and wrote very strongly in favor of Scopes. But a lot of black churches in America supported Bryan very publicly. And you can see things like the Pittsburgh Courier just waffling on the issue because they didn't know which way to go.
Yeah, the late historian of science, Jeffrey Moran, did some really wonderful work on that.
He did.
In terms of Professor Larson's mention of the Klan's role in this, gives a suggestion of why Bryan's efforts to create a broader religious coalition, to bring in Catholics and Jews, was not terribly successful because, the anti-Catholicism and to a somewhat, but not much lesser degree, anti-Semitism was such an intense part of many branches of white American Protestantism in this era. It's hard for us to conceive of just how thoroughly these Protestant groups define themselves by anti-Catholicism. Mm-hmm. So even if some Catholics were uncomfortable with the teaching of evolution, there was not much opportunity for building common cause there. I think it's also notable that in the 1970s and 1980s, as conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals begin to grow closer together, I could be just totally blanking on something, but I don't believe intelligent design or creationism was a significant part of that coming together.
It was abortion.
Yeah. I have no idea about the Mormon Church, the LDS Church. That would be perhaps some work's been done. It would be a fascinating topic. I'm curious about it myself now.
Other questions?
Based on some reading I've done in the past on this issue, the thing that impressed me was the way the fundamentalists were able to organize. And what shocked me, as I dug into this a little bit, was the number of schools that the fundamentalists started for their own versions of Christianity. Can you elaborate on that to some degree? This was not something I wanted to spend my life trying to understand, but it was a surprise because it didn't seem to me that the liberals were as well organized in response. Maybe the ACLU, maybe they turned to the ACLU to try to to stay in the game, shall we say. But there didn't seem to be anything similar to the fundamentalists and their extensive schools on the liberal side.
You want to take the lead?
Yeah. I mean, I think I think a lot of it comes down to in the 1920s and in the following decades, liberal Protestants are very dominant in American culture and society. And so they don't feel any particular need to build alternative institutions just because they have such influence within the institutions already existing.
I agree.
And so, so if you wanted to do something different, if you wanted to create an alternative to that, your only opportunity was to do what those fundamentalists did and create your own network of institutions, which, many of them were centered here in Chicago. Professor Larson mentioned the Moody Bible Institute, which was probably the most important. But it was a network that spread across the United States. It didn't, like I said, you can't draw a direct line between the building of those institutions and the rise of the Christian right. But the rise of the Christian right would not have been possible without those institutions built back in the 1910s and 1920s and 1930s. There's been some wonderful historical work done on this topic. Joel Carpenter's book, Revive Us Again, I can't recommend that enough to people who are interested in it. So that would just be my initial answer.
I agree with everything you said. You'd get, keeping in focus on Chicago, an early example of that would be Wheaton College here. You had it was viewed that the established churches, established institutions. I mean, Horace Mann started public education in Massachusetts with a strongly Protestant bent. He was trying to browbeat everybody into Protestantism. That led, when the Catholics came over to places like Boston, they wanted to have their own schools because they didn't trust the Catholics, the public schools, because the public schools were Protestant. True in New York, true in Philadelphia, true here in Chicago. That's where you had the Catholic school movement of the 1800s, late 1800s. Catholics also built their own colleges, Fordham or you name it, these Catholic colleges all over. Evangelicals followed that lead, starting with things like, because they had started Harvard and Yale and Princeton as Protestant places, and now they'd become secular, so they had the Wheatons and the Calvins. I do think that the creation evolution controversy really supercharged that movement. Of course, the classic example is Bryan College. Dayton got a college out of this. When Bryan died, they raised money, and I was speaking at Bryan College 2 months ago. It's still there. And there was this call that we can't trust being in the public colleges and public high schools. And they started building, but it was mostly colleges back then. Then comes later, starting with the creation science movement, which begins with 1961 with Morris's Genesis flood. Then you see, and parallel to this, the forced integration of schools in the South and the opening of basically all white private academies throughout the South. Many of those became prime plucking grounds for the evangelicals. A lot of them taught creation science when it came around. And again, it only started in 61. And then there was an increased movement. And then when you took prayer out of the public schools with the Schempp decision. That was another argument. We need our own schools where we can have prayer. And then you go step by step by step down this avenue with, as you started us out, schools being the best vehicle politically. That's what Brian figured out. Remember, the creation evolution, well, the anti-evolution movement predated Brian. But by making the target public schools, he could make it a target everyone could relate to because everyone has kids. And whereas it's what's taught in the church, well, it's not my church, that became the battleground. So yes, you have this rise, and then you add to it not only the Christian school movement, which now is very large, maybe 10% of the school children, the homeschool movement, which built on it, which has another 10%. And now, of course, you might have, when the Supreme Court decides in a month, you might have internet schools getting charter school funding in a state like Oklahoma, and they can be expressly religious as well. So good question. I just wanted to sort of bring it forward to today.
Yeah, she's bringing you a microphone.
Thank you so much. I want to ask about the experts that were in the trial, and I think Professor Schultz mentioned conflicting classes of experts. So I was wondering if you could speak more about that and about how expertise was invoked and the concept of expert witnesses that they had at the time.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, when I brought up conflicting experts, it was less the specific experts in the trial than just the broader idea of a class of experts being pastors, biblical interpreters, clashing with what they saw as correctly, I think, an emerging, more secular intelligentsia. But I would be, curious to hear. I don't really know much about the lineups of the expert witnesses in these cases, so
Including a few from University of Chicago.
Yeah, basically the problem was, it was originally billed, Brian originally billed this trial when he volunteered to go down and help the prosecution. And then Darrow volunteered to help the defense team. And Darrow was from Chicago, remember, he was a lawyer here. Only time in his life he ever volunteered free legal service was the scope trial. Brian said this is going to be a battle royal. He lived in his own world. He thought that experts were on his side. And he was going to bring in a bunch of experts. And the judge himself said, we're going to hold a summer Chautauqua. You don't know what a Chautauqua is, but before television, they had these summer lecture series. That's why it was held in the summer. It wasn't supposed to have court at that time. That's why the big famous cross-examination was outside in the grounds with thousands of people watching. This was a public event. It was broadcast nationally on the radio from WGN. That was broadcast out of Chicago, nationwide.
World's greatest newspaper.
World's greatest newspaper. It was filmed. The whole trial was filmed, and the film was shown around America. And those things never had happened before. So they thought they were going to have battling experts. But the trouble is, Brian and the prosecution couldn't find any credible expert. They couldn't find anyone. Brian was shocked. There's no expert, while the defense had a lineup. People were fighting to be the experts, including some like Shaler Matthews from the Divinity School here. But from Princeton and from Columbia, from Johns Hopkins, from Vanderbilt, from the state. And they had all these experts. And that's why when the trial actually came, the prosecution said no experts. The only issue here is whether Scopes taught evolution. We're going to have no experts at all. So no experts were allowed to testify. They wrote their items up, their thoughts up for depositions that were then submitted to the Supreme Court to say if the judge was wrong for excluding experts. But Brian thought he had science on his side. He did not view this as a clash between science and religion. He was a proud member of the AAAS, American Academy of
Advancement of Science.
Advancement of Science. And he said evolution false is science falsely so-called. It's not real science. He never said he was battling against science. Same way with later, when you have creation science come about or intelligent design, there they do bring experts to their trials, like the Dover trial. They don't get very far, but they try. And creation scientists think they are offering, or at least profess, they are offering science. And that secular science is blinded by this devotion to methodological and philosophical naturalism, to use their phrase. And therefore, they're only looking for natural rather than supernatural answers. And if you open your lens to allow supernatural answers, you can have true science. The sort of science that would fit the Baconian model of the Royal Society, the original Royal Society.
First this gentleman and then you.
Hi, thank you guys so much. So I work in the field of population genetics, which is kind of underlies a lot of the science behind understanding the mechanisms of evolution. And I was just curious, considering population genetics, the field was really kind of taking off in the 20s and 30s. Do you think the outcome of the Scopes trial had any significant impact on kind of slowing the movement of the progression of those, of population genetics and kind of associated evolutionary sciences? Or do you think it was purely just cultural and science just chugged along?
Yeah, I can't think of any evidence that I can't think of any evidence that it slowed up population genetics at all. I mean, and of course, the population genetics that they were doing in the 1920s is very different from the kind that you're doing today. If anything, just drawing from a very, very, very small data set, I'd say that in some cases the involvement. I mean, just to bring it home to UChicago, and like the involvement of some of the UChicago scientists who came to testify, it actually sort of boosted their careers, or like boosted, like certainly. Help me out. The anthropologist was Cole, Faye Cooper Cole.
Yeah.
So
Good memory.
this is a sort of anthropologist who did like wide-ranging anthropology. I mean, after he submitted testimony, there was like calls from all over to have him fired, and instead he got a promotion, and his classes became more popular than ever. So that doesn't bear precisely on how his research was accepted. Although he actually did become a popularizer of evolution. So no, I would say among scientists, quite the opposite.
If you were looking for a founder of population genetics, it'd be Fisher in England, the Galton professor. And he, right then, with Haldane, were founding population genetics. And yet Fisher was, he was a high church Anglican. He was very, very religious. And Haldane's father, who was a big scientist, had given whatever that great science and religion lecture that still's given in England. His father had given that. And so it was Haldane and Fisher. But the population genetics hadn't reached anyone at the Scopes trial. That was just coming together in the mid-20s.
Hold up for the microphone.
There's somebody back there too.
Thank you. So I'm teaching a class this quarter. My students are here on schooling and the culture wars. It's called Beyond the Culture Wars, Social Movements and the Politics of Education. And when we studied the Scopes trial toward the beginning of the quarter, because we're studying 100 years of conflict over education in one quarter, it's hard not to note the parallels between the 1920s and the 2020s. When you think of, Professor Larson, when you were going through your list of all the sorts of social upheaval that were happening at the time, World War I, Spanish flu, mass immigration, the Great Migration, et cetera. We generated a parallel list in my class, the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement for LGBTQ rights, the COVID-19 pandemic, mass anxieties about immigration and movement of populations all over the world due to global conflict. So,
You'd almost think America first.
America first, exactly. So, I'd be interested to hear you speak more about what you make of these parallels, and to some extent, one of the reasons I designed the class this way is to give a little bit of comfort or historical context to the crisis around education that we're in now, the controversies over critical race theory and LGBTQ representation in books and so forth, to say some of this is old wine in new bottles. We've been here before. We've been having this argument over and over again for 100 years. But also it's supercharged right now because it's nationalized. And there are lots of parallels, but there are things that are different. And I'm interested to hear the panel speak to what's new and what's old, and what you make of the parallels.
Well, first, as someone who regularly teaches a class called The Culture Wars, I would love to talk with you about how you're approaching it. I'd love to hear from the students, too. I mean, I would agree with what Professor Rossi said earlier. It's hard to draw like a direct line between, certain forms of anti-evolution in the 1920s and vaccine skepticism in the 2020s, other than a very crooked and winding line. I will say one thing that I think is different, and in a way that affects the dynamics of how these things play out, which is the really swift decline of liberal Protestantism over the past couple decades, which, as we've talked about, played an important role in debates over evolution. Yeah, an important counterweight, that they would bring liberal Protestants forward to say one can believe in evolution and theism. These ideas are compatible. They don't need to be in conflict. Showing that there were different ways to be religious, Christian, Protestant. The University of Chicago's own Langdon Gilkey, who was a professor of theology for a long time, throughout the 70s and 80s, he was a writer, popularizer, and expert witness talking about how, evolution and Christianity were fully compatible.
Yes.
And you don't really have many figures like Gilkey anymore. You don't have people articulating that different way of being religious. And so I think in the public mind, and to some degree in reality, religion increasingly comes to mean conservative forms of Christianity. And like I said, I think that alters how these debates play out. So all of which is to say, I think the continuities are quite important and the similarities. This is one point where I would see change.
Okay.
I'd certainly underscore the Langdon Gilkey point. I got to know the judge who, in the Arkansas, when they overturned, he was an expert witness in the Arkansas case that overturned the Balanced Treatment Act in Arkansas, which is the second iteration of the creation evolution controversy. And it was Langdon Gilkey, single-handedly. The judge said, it was all him. He was like God. I thought I was hearing God talk to me. Now, if you go to the Dover trial, which is the key trial in the third iteration, intelligent design, and I'm going to be with Judge Jones in about a month and a half. He said it's all Ken Miller. Ken Miller is a Roman Catholic who is big on reconciling the two. And it was a very devout Roman Catholic and also a textbook writer, but a professor at Brown, biology professor. And he said, that's what decided me. It was Ken Miller. So these people are critical. The people who look for a reconciliation. And among evangelical Protestants, who I mentioned earlier, the head of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, and his Biologists Institute, really fight hard. And that's a whole institute, really fight hard to say that evolution, maybe theistic form of evolution, but evolution is compatible with fully compatible with Christianity. I do believe that's the, if you really ask Pope Francis or the current Pope Leo from Chicago, I'm sure they would say the same thing.
So I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the last question. Okay, in a sentence or two, who won the Scopes trial on the day after the decision, before Brian dies? And your choices are the ACLU, Scopes, the prosecution, the defense, or Dayton.
Can I say we all lost? Is that too glib?
And is your opinion different if we fast forward to today?
I know. I think it's I'm gonna break with the mold of my profession and say it's a highly presentist opinion.
It's a highly
presentist. It's all about today.
Okay.
So, one thing I will say is that the way the trial has been mythologized, which again, Professor Larson talks about so well in this book, suggests that a winner, to some degree, was the way the ACLU wanted to approach it, even if that's not how it looked in the immediate aftermath. That it has since become this kind of totemic symbol of the struggle for academic freedom. Now, as we know, as we talked about here, that's not really what happened. But the development of that myth is important. And it has really shaped the way that a lot of the debates have gone. You know, when you want to symbolize this struggle, this conflict, you invoke the Scopes trial. Even The Simpsons did it, though that's now an increasingly dated reference. So
Last word.
I agree with both of you. I do think we all lost, but they all claim, every side, and I'm not saying there are more than two, they all claimed victory. They all got richer. They all raised more money. They all attracted more followers. They made it a bigger issue. And so in that way, Dayton too, got a college, grew bigger. In that way, with their own agendas, they all won in their own way. Maybe society lost, so they all lost. The last thing I'll say is, one thing I did with my book is, since every newspaper was following this, on the day after, every newspaper in America, virtually, I read over 200 of them, had editorials asking the question, who won and who lost? And I read every one. Nobody thought either side won. They all thought it was a draw. They all thought all they did was stir a pot. And we're going to inherit the wind.
Wow. So, well, on that note, let's go stir the pot.